Salt Lake. Thank you all for being here. It hit me yesterday a little bit different that I think we're in the tournament of our ages, and this is the field. And I so very much appreciate all of you being here, bringing all of your work, all of your collaboration, your energy, and your brilliance, your drive, your expertise to this field, to this team, all working for a common cause. So thanks for being here. If you're not a member of Friends of Great Salt Lake, please scan the QR code sometime today, click in, join for $30 a year to make it all official. Let's see, as we're getting going today, reminder that we have 11:45 awards presentation of our Doyle-Stevens scholarships, and then stay this evening for our poster session after we wrap up with our formal program. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ben Stireman, our moderator for the panel this morning. And again, big grateful heart for all of you being here and part of this work that we're doing. Thank you.
We have a small presentation we're going to do before our panel.
Would you like me to go grab you a coffee?
Oh, thank you. Wow.
Do you want me to grab you a coffee?
No, thank you
sure?
so much.
I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Happy birthday, Ben!
Thank you. Yeah, it's my birthday. This is the best way I could possibly imagine to spend it too. Oh man. Wait. All right. That was pretty good. My wife will appreciate that. Thanks for taking care of me. All right. So, let's move on. Let's move on. All right. Okay. So, we're here today to talk about our Salinity Advisory Committee, which I consider to be one of the most functional organizations working on Great Salt Lake issues. So we have with us Kyle Stone with the Division of Wildlife Resources, Phil Brown with Great Salt Lake Artemia, and Christine Rumsey from the United States Geological Survey. These are three of the finest subsets of the committee members. But before we get started, I also see some of the Salinity Committee members or their alternates in the crowd. Will you guys raise your hands if you are on the, yes, awesome. So you can see these are some dedicated folks. They're here early. They want to hear about all the things Great Salt Lake. But I will jump right into it here. So we're not going to do a traditional panel. I think what we decided is we want to give you a slight overview or a little bit of a window into each of what we do. So we're going to spend the first half of our panel session doing some quick presentations, and then the last half we'll do some Q&A, and we'll leave a little bit of time for you all to ask questions as well. So what is the Salinity Committee? This is right off of our charter. So the goal of the Great Salt Lake Salinity Advisory Committee is to guide the process of developing and, in the end, providing recommendations to forestry, fire, and state lands and water quality on long-term management of the salinity of Great Salt Lake. So we've done a lot of work over the years to characterize, what it means, what the salinity means. How are we measuring it? What depths? How do we have uniform processes so we can actually characterize this and report it, and it makes sense. And then we can also use that science to make management decisions. And we have three objectives that have a lot of little sub-bullets, so I'd encourage you to go to our website at forestryfireandstatelands.utah.gov. Take a look at our charters there, and you can see all the different things that we're managing for. But these are our three main objectives. We want to foster a partnership among stakeholders, guide the process of advancing the scientific understanding of Great Salt Lake salinity, and guide the process of evaluating the science and make recommendations to Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and Division of Water Quality. So here are the members of the Salinity Committee, and why do we like them? Well, these are a multidisciplinary group of people. We have public universities, private universities, industry, state, and federal agencies all working together on this common issue. And we especially like them because this was not a statutory mandate. We're doing this because we all recognized that there was an issue that needed better understanding, and we came together to work collectively to try to solve those issues. So These folks are not, getting paid extra. They don't get bonuses at the end of the year because they come to all of our salinity committee meetings. They do it because they love the lake, and we're trying to make it a better place. So thanks to everybody who participates in that. And with that, and I also wanted to throw this out here. This is just a constant source of news, salinity on Great Salt Lake. When we were hitting historic low lake levels in 2022, we were also, am I in trouble? Oh,
Just want to maybe.
do I need to do this? Oh, no, there we go. Yeah. All right, thank you. So with that, we've had a lot of headlines that relate to salinity. When we hit the 2022 record low, we also were hitting salinity thresholds that were threatening the ecosystem. So the salinity committee decided to modify the berm and help to make that recommendation. And it's honestly what allowed us to export hundreds of millions of tons of salt to the North Arm and balance out that salinity again in the South Arm. Now today we have tools and understanding of the salinity that allows us to keep salinity out of the headlines and focus on other things that matter as well. And now we're moving on to other larger issues and tackling other important issues as well. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Kyle. He's going to talk a little bit about why we care. I'll trade you spots if you don't mind introducing Phil when you're done. Go for it.
Okay, hopefully the microphone works. Sounds like it. All right, so like Ben said, I'm Kyle Stone, and I'm with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And so my role, and kind of mine and John Luff's role on the Salinity Advisory Committee, has been to speak for wildlife when it comes to the decisions that are being made. And so I kind of want to talk about how Great Salt Lake is connected to the rest of the world, right? We're all used to the very flat satellite imagery, and just everybody knows how low the lake is. So this is a different kind of perspective of the lake, because the lake is globally important. And there are many different ways that the lake is connected to the rest of the world. And I mean, you've heard some of them, whether it's tourism, minerals, snow, Olympics, right? We're tied to the world in a lot of different ways. And the way that I'm concerned about how we're connected to the rest of the world is through the wildlife and the food web of specifically the South Arm of Great Salt Lake. Because when we talk about salinity in the lake, we're really focused on, right now, under low lake conditions, the South Arm of Great Salt Lake. So this is kind of a simplified version of the food web as we understand it. And if you look at the bottom here, there's that tagline that temperature and salinity will affect these things in varying ways and to different degrees, right? So that's one of the things that we're going to focus on today in this talk. So migration is a big way that we are connected to the rest of the world. So everybody knows that we get millions of birds that come through the lake, hundreds of different species that are here, whether that's waterfowl, shorebirds, waterbirds, other neotropic migrants that are just coming through the lake to utilize the resources that are here for migration. And I want to focus on two species today, the Wilson's phalarope and redneck phalaropes, and then the eared grebe. So phalarope are unique little birds that come here, and they will focus on foraging on brine flies, and they will double their body weight while they're here for their non-stop flight migration to Argentina. We have, peak counts in the 90s of up to 600,000 Wilson's phalarope, nearly 250,000 of redneck phalarope that come through, and these represent a third and either 10% of the populations respectively. But we do actively survey for these birds and have been since the 1980s when we started specifically looking for phalarope and keeping track of those in our water bird survey since 1997. And then since 2019, we've been part of a phalarope working group where we actually go out and John Neal and John Luff fly on the plane, and we specifically look for just phalarope on those days to understand the numbers that are here and what they're doing to utilize the resources that are here. It's a very difficult counts because these species do tend to mix, they look similar, and it's hard to get really true solid estimates of the birds that are here. These surveys are done in conjunction with several other groups at similar times so that way we can get kind of a region-wide snapshot of what these birds are doing. To talk about kind of fly abundance, this is one of those things that we're really just starting to get a handle on. There's a poster in the next room, so please come to the poster session later today, and we'll talk about the emerging fly research that Dr. Gary Belevsky and Leanne Chambers are working on with us to understand this side of the life cycle, where we've got kind of this benthic ecosystem. And I've got this other picture here. If you look at that black sprayer bottle that's kind of down in the bottom of the photo, that one's supposed to be white. And that's just brine flies that are all over our boat that day. And Jim Van Leeuwen's here. He recently retired from our program. Huge loss of institutional knowledge, so we're glad that he's with us here today. But the flies are just so abundant, and we don't really have a qualitative number or a quantitative number quite yet. So this is just a kind of anecdotal picture to show how much biomass is available to these birds that they're using. On the other side of the ecosystem, we have the eared grebes. So these guys come here, similar time frame, peak in October. We get anywhere from 3 to 5 million of them. We have some peak counts that are quite high. They're also going to double their body weight while they're here and go through a feather molt. So once they're here, they're stuck here. And these birds, in these counts, they're representing almost 95% of the population that's coming here to Great Salt Lake. And while they're doubling their body weight, they actually atrophy their flight muscles, like those actually get reduced. Their intestinal tract increases so they can get every bit of caloric content out of these brine shrimp. And we find that, you know, they focus on this other side of the food web. So we have the benthic side with the flies. This is the more pelagic side with the brine shrimp. And we do have quantitative numbers for brine shrimp because that's what we've been focused on for the entirety of our program since, you know, for the last 30 plus years. And these are numbers from 2015 that I put together because we had one of our peak counts for eared grebes. So if you look here, we did a flight on October 21st, which is going to be this highest peak kind of in orange in the center of the graph, where we had an estimated high of 5.5 million eared grebes. From some work done with Utah State and Mike Conover's lab, we understand that eared grebes need almost 30,000 brine shrimp per day per grebe to put on that body weight so that they can survive migration. That's what this red line at the bottom is. Take 30,000 brine shrimp times 5.5 million eared grebes, you get 165 billion shrimp per day being eaten by eared grebes. The orange line here is the number of adult brine shrimp in the lake at this lake elevation when you correct for individuals per liter of water and convert that to number of total of individuals in that lake volume at that time. And you can see they're really only eating a very small portion of the brine shrimp that are available to them until you get into that November, December timeframe when the shrimp are starting to suffer the effects of temperature. And then we do see a kind of a suppression. And this particular year, we can actually track when eared grebes leave based on weather radar. And so we're seeing that they started leaving kind of that tail end of November, but it was as the brine shrimp were declining. So some of these interesting values, but this really kind of puts in perspective like how much is available to them and why they're coming here for that resource. The other way we're connected to the world through brine shrimp is through the harvest industry. So brine shrimp have this unique pathway where they can produce live young or they can produce these cysts, and that's going to be this graphic on the left here, a close-up of the cysts and then kind of that scale versus a dime. And this is the product that's harvested by the commercial brine shrimp fishery. And they use that product in the aquaculture industry to feed table shrimp that you buy. If you buy farm-raised shrimp, it's most likely going to have fed brine shrimp from the Great Salt Lake. And I think Phil's going to talk about that a little bit more and just kind of how valuable that is. But the way we've always managed brine shrimp is for the harvestable excess. So this graphic here is our harvest model. This was developed by Dr. Belevsky for us, and it continues to work even to today in conditions that we have really not seen when this thing was built. But we've basically found that maximum sustained yield, which is going to be right around that top peak of that yellow curve there, where there's such thing as too many cysts left in the lake. You'll get too many of them hatch out. They'll eat themselves out of house and home, and then you just don't have enough to survive to reproduction for that first generation. Also, on the left side here, if you don't have enough at the start in the spring, you're just not going to have enough brine shrimp to produce a very much extra, because the main thing that we manage for as the Division of Wildlife is for the birds first. and then the harvest after that. So this 21 cysts per liter is kind of a number that we've used as a rough estimate, but it's really based on these graphics and where we fall on either the left side or the right side of this curve. That's going to be kind of the quick overview that I have, and then Phil, if you want to take it from there and talk about the industry and why that's important.
Okay, thank you. My name's Phil Brown. I'm with the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative, Great Salt Lake Artemia. So we're the brine shrimp folks. We're the company that harvests the brine shrimp cysts on Great Salt Lake, and we supply aquaculture operations around the world. And so I'm going to try to cover a fair amount of ground here about aquaculture, Artemia, its salinity tolerance, and why salinity is so much on our radar, and how that ties into the management actions on the causeway berm. And so we'll start out with Artemia and aquaculture. This is a fascinating and unlikely story, and I wish I had the time here today to do it justice. So we'll just stick with one slide, and suffice it to say that a good portion of the modern global aquaculture that occurs today would not be possible without Artemia, and it still isn't possible without Artemia. And so it's a linchpin for aquaculture development. A lot of the table shrimp that you find at the grocery store, a lot of those farm shrimp that supply income and food to millions of people across Asia, Central and South America, the farmed sea bass and sea bream in the Mediterranean and Europe, these all require Artemia nauplii, the hatchling Artemia, as a critical live feed during a very particular and fragile part of the early life cycle of these cultured organisms. So that's what makes this possible. You know, Artemia is a critical live feed, and the question becomes why Artemia and why not something else to fill this role? And there are certain attributes of Artemia that are very important. The first is that it's the correct size and the correct nutrition for these cultured organisms. It has high protein, high digestibility. It's a live feed, so it triggers a predatory feeding response from these larval organisms. And there are benefits to the growth and development of these larval organisms that live feed provides that cannot be provided by formulated feed, even if the nutritional profile looks the same on paper. Live feed is a critical part of this. It's also very easy for these farmers to use. It comes as dehydrated cysts in a can. They can easily hatch it on demand. That's a very unique proposition in the zooplankton world. And it provides a high level of biosecurity for these farmers because it is a cleaned product and it comes from a place that does not have aquaculture pathogens. Great Salt Lake is too salty for that. And so it's critical to aquaculture, and Great Salt Lake is the largest single supply of Artemia in the world. It supplies roughly half, and it is for sure the most stable and well-managed Artemia system in the world supplying aquaculture. And so a key part of why Artemia works so well for aquaculture involves its unique life cycle. Artemia is very good at enduring and surviving adverse environmental conditions, and that can be seen through the life cycle that it chooses. It has two reproductive modes that it can engage in depending on the environmental conditions in the lake. It produces live birth, or nauplii, when the conditions are favorable. So when the food is abundant, when the temperatures are correct, when the salinities are correct. And this nauplii production is the most abundant in spring and early summer when the temperatures are warming and when the algal food resource is abundant in the lake. When conditions are not favorable or when they're deteriorating, they switch to production of these encysted embryos that are in dormancy, and those are called cysts. Cysts are very durable. They can endure freezing temperatures, desiccation, scorching temperatures, UV exposure, no oxygen, and they can do this for years. And they're designed to help the Artemia population endure conditions that kill off the adult population, and every year that is the winter water temperatures. In the fall, they sense the approach of winter, and they produce a lot of cysts, and those cysts remain in the lake even as the winter temperatures kill off all of the adults, and so those cysts remain for spring to restart the Artemia population and begin that cycle anew. Okay, so salinity is crucially important for Artemia. Salinity is why they can exist in Great Salt Lake in the first place, and it goes along with their life strategy. Artemia are physiologically very impressive organisms, very durable, but physically they are not very good at evading predators and they're not very good at competition. So if you think of fight or flight, Artemia are not good at either of those things. And so they rely on the high salinity of the lake to exclude predators and competitors, and that's the niche that they fill, and they're very good at it. But that requires a certain salinity range. And so they can survive very well in oceanic salinities. They can do that very well, but the problem is a lot of other organisms can, organisms that would exclude them from that habitat. And so it's not until you get to about 90 grams per liter that you can be certain that predatory invertebrates are excluded from the system. And then around that salinity range, you also have the possibility of unfavorable phytoplankton community shifts. And so the lower salinity range we like to see in the Great Salt Lake for this Artemia population is about 100 grams per liter. Now, that's ecological interaction setting the lower limit. The upper limit of salinity for Artemia is governed by its ability to osmoregulate. So Artemia maintain a fairly consistent internal salinity. And so as the salinity in the water surrounding them increases, they're ingesting that water as they're filtering out the phytoplankton. And they have to remove that excess salt to maintain their internal salinity. And that's very energetically expensive, and there's a limit to what they can do. And so literature values and what we've seen in our own data strongly suggest that this upper limit is right around 180 grams per liter. Around that time, you start to get adverse impacts to the Artemia population. A better salinity range is about 160. So because salinity is so important, as brine shrimp folk, we pay very close attention to it. And in 2017, we saw a very large salinity change in the Great Salt Lake, the South Arm, due to the opening of the causeway breach. And what happened is you had an enormous influx of South Arm water into the North Arm. This breach was open. The head difference caused a one-way flow into the north. We had a high spring runoff, and so for months it was just pumping South Arm water into the North Arm and taking salt with it. And so we noticed that in the salinity. Salinities declined that year to a low of 110 grams per liter, whereas they had been at 160 before the breach was open. And it's a big change in salinity. And so for the next couple years, we enjoyed that bump in lake elevation, lower salinities. It was a very healthy salinity range for the brine shrimp population. But 2018 to 2020 were years of fairly low runoff, and so the lake was declining during that time period. And in 2020, we started to notice the salinities creeping back upwards again, which was expected for the lake lowering. But what we noticed is that this salinity increase was occurring out of proportion to the lake level decline, and that caught our attention. And so we looked, this can be seen when you plot salinity versus lake elevation. That's the graph on the left. The relationship between salinity and lake elevation in the 6 years prior to the breach opening is shown in the black data points. And so it's a fairly tight correlation where the standing salt mass in the South Arm is diluted or concentrated depending on whether the lake is going up and down. But in the years following the causeway breach opening, after all that salt had moved north, that relationship shifted downwards. Those are the blue data points, and at any given lake salinity, you had a lower, any given lake elevation, you had a lower salinity. When we saw the salinities increase in 2020, this is what was happening to that relationship. It was shifting back up towards the old relationship, and it was suggesting that salt mass was coming back in. And indeed, when we used our salinity data and calculated the amount of salt in Gilbert Bay, not the salinity, but the amount of salt, we saw that a lot had been exported to the north when the breach was open, but that most of it had returned by the end of 2021. And this salt return was not a good thing at this time because the lake was lowering and salinities were creeping back above that optimal salinity range again. So this was a problem. We brought this to the attention of the Salinity Advisory Committee, and they discussed it and asked the USGS to verify these findings using their independent data set and their independent data collection and using their very specific and scientifically rigorous measurement techniques. And the results held. They found the similar pattern. And so the committee discussed this, and recommended raising the adaptive management berm in the causeway breach to halt that return flow of heavy brine from the north arm and promote continued export of water and brine from the south arm into the north to try to contain this increase in salinity that was occurring. And so they did that, and frankly, it's a really good thing that they did, because 2022 would test the upper salinity range for the Artemia and Great Salt Lake, and it would do it in a way that I haven't seen in my 16, 17 years looking at lake data. So 2022 was the year where we had very poor runoff after several years of poor runoff, and it hit that record low lake elevation. And in turn, we had record high salinities. The year started at 180 grams per liter in spring, and by the time the evaporation season was over, it had increased to 187 grams per liter in the south arm of Great Salt Lake, and that was a record high for our data set. It was high enough that we were detecting the genetic sequences of north arm Dunaliella in the south arm during that time. And the effect on the Artemia population was readily apparent. We had a very delayed population start and growth that year, about 2 months later than the data set average. We had very altered reproductive timing. We had an early pulse of cyst production, followed by very underwhelming low cyst production numbers throughout summer and fall. The quality of the cysts in the lake was very poor hatching rates. And the animals, the Artemia themselves, were visibly stressed throughout much of summer and fall. They were smaller in body size. They'd taken on a more red coloration. They were less vigorous. They were exhibiting signs of stress. And it wasn't until November, when the temperature started slacking off, that we started to see a bit of a recovery in the condition of those animals. And so this, we can't be sure what the absolute upper limit for a viable population of Artemia is in Great Salt Lake, but this was pushing it far beyond what we were comfortable seeing. These were not healthy salinities. And so we were a bit of a tipping point there. Now, fortunately, in the background of all this, the berm had been raised for part of that year, and so that export of salt out of the south arm had been ongoing for part of that year, and that's a good thing because the salinities would have been a little bit higher had it not. And then in 2023, we had a reprieve. We had, I think someone called it snowpocalypse yesterday, which is, I like that term, that's good, but it's got kind of a negative connotation. This was a very good thing, so, maybe something closer to Snowapalooza would be appropriate, but, it was a very needed runoff year. We had record snowpack, we had very high runoff into the lake, and the lake went up, salinities went down. By midsummer, we had a low of 130 grams per liter, and then it only reached 145 grams per liter in autumn, and those are healthy salinities, and the brine shrimp population responded very quickly to this. We had a much more normal population start and population growth timing. We had very good reproductive output, high cyst production, and the cysts that were produced that year were very high quality. And so it goes to show that if you add water, if you keep the salinities in a correct range, this is a very durable organism and population that can bounce back from the brink very quickly. And because the berm has been exporting salt into the North Arm throughout that time period, this good salinity range has continued throughout 2024, 25, and even now in 2026, when the lake is reaching low elevations again, the salinity remains in a healthy range. And this demonstrates that the berm is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And it's keeping salt within the salinity, salt mass within a range that the lake elevation can provide a good salinity. And so conversations in the Salinity Advisory Committee are now very different than they might have been. We're talking about longer term management strategies rather than having to address in a short term emergency measures to prevent ecosystem collapse. And so that's a very big win right now. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Christine Rumsey. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey here in Salt Lake City. And the USGS sits on the Salinity Advisory Committee as a non-voting member to provide science and information. The USGS is a federal agency. We're a part of the Department of Interior, and we're an entity devoted to just science data collection, and providing, we're just what I'm trying to say. We're non-regulatory, that's what I wanted to say. We don't regulate anything, we just provide science. So our role on the Salinity Advisory Committee is to, kind of when we have routine meetings, is to update the group on the status of the lake and to collect a whole bunch of data that we can use to better understand the system. And I just wanted to highlight that the USGS, we have really strict protocols for data collection and for interpretation of data, for reviewing it. And I wanted to just acknowledge all the folks involved in generating the data sets that the Salinity Advisory Committee uses. There's a whole bunch of people at the USGS in our office who are really active in collecting these data and making sure they're really high quality, that we can rely on for understanding the Great Salt Lake. So I'll just start with going through the monitoring program that we run in partnership with our state agencies. First of all, we measure the lake elevations in the north and south arms at the saline gauge in the north arm and the Solitaire Marine in the south arm. And these are the gauges that we've been collecting for decades. In the case of the south arm, we've been collecting since the 1847, so about 180 years. And so when you hear about lake elevations in the news, these are the gauges that everyone is referring to. We also monitor South Arm salinity every month in partnership with the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program. We measure at 4 locations throughout the South Arm. We also measure surface water inflows coming in as well as the salinity coming in. So through this monitoring program, we're essentially measuring what's coming into the lake, the amount of water and the salinity. We're measuring what's in the lake in terms of the volume that's in the South Arm and the salinity that's there. And then also the exchanges in the causeway. So that black line in the map is the railroad causeway that bisects the north and the south arms. And so we also heavily instrument the exchange of water between the north and the south arms along the causeway. And I'll just dig into that a little bit more because it's a really complex location. So that photo on the upper right side is what this breach looks like. So it's about a 100-foot wide opening in the railroad causeway. And this is where the north and the south arms of the Great Salt Lake mix. And so what you have is an open channel of water. The south arm, which is less dense, flows over the north arm water, which sinks because of its density. And so essentially you have just a water column of water with water moving in 2 different directions. It's very, very difficult to measure. And so what we do is we have an acoustic Doppler current profiler. This is like a little boat we track on the surface of the water to basically scan the water velocities throughout the column and map the cross-sectional area. And that allows us to get a discharge measurement at a point in time. We do that every month. We also track water surface elevations on either side of the causeway berm. We have an instrument that also continuously measures water velocities throughout the water column. We measure weather parameters like air temperature, wind speed, direction, barometric pressure, and the bathymetry, or the shape of that channel. All of these variables we're measuring continuously are used by Sam Dutta and his team at Utah State University to basically model what that exchange of flow is in those 2 directions. It's really complex modeling, but we're getting there, and we've been working on this for years. I think it's safe to say this is one of the most difficult sites to measure in the country because of the hydraulics and the physics that are at play right there. And then, of course, when we go out there, we also collect water and measure salinity and nutrients because we want to know how much mass flux is also happening at this location where the two arms of the lake meet. And before I go on and show you the salinity data and the record, I just want to point out simply what salinity is. Let's just think about that for just a second. And very simply, it is the mass of water that is, or mass of salt that is dissolved in water. And while that conceptually we kind of all intuitively know that, I just want to emphasize the variables that create salinity, both the mass of salt that goes into it, as well as the volume of water go in. So if you add more mass of salt to the water, more salt, you get a saltier water. If you add more water to the system, you get a less salty volume of water. And salt is kind of a general term if we think about dissolved salts. It's really about the kind of ions, the major ions that make up that water. And for Great Salt Lake, the major ions in the water are chloride and sodium with some amounts of sulfate and magnesium. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about salt. And for Great Salt Lake, currently what we're looking at in terms of salinity in the south arm is around 120 grams per liter in the south arm, and then in the north arm around 300 grams per liter. And many of you know this, but the difference between these 2 salinities is really due to the fact that major surface water inflows, so water from the Bear River, the Weber River, the Jordan River, which enters through Farmington Bay and Goggin Drain, that's all entering in the south arm. And so that south arm remains fresher, and the limited exchange between the north and the south arms caused by the railroad causeway creates the kind of stratification we see spatially, where the north arm can be this really highly concentrated brine at 300 grams per liter. So the north arm's coming in and out of halite saturation. Sodium chloride is actively coming in and out of solution there. So the exchange between these two arms, you're moving a ton of salt in that exchange, and that's really relevant to the Salinity Advisory Committee when they think about controlling or trying to manage salinity in the south arm. We have a standardized method for measuring salinity, and that is the Great Salt Lake equation of state. Simply, this is a very difficult, complicated equation that relates density, temperature to the salinity. And what this allows us to do is to use an instrument called a densiometer to measure the salinity and get a measurement in about 3 minutes. And it's robust and cost effective. And the Salinity Advisory Committee has sort of adopted this method as a standardized way of measuring salinity for Great Salt Lake. And so USGS, we use it, Utah Geological Survey uses it. It's a published method that really anyone can pick up and use to measure Great Salt Lake salinity. Okay, so let's dig into the records that USGS has developed and what the Salinity Advisory Committee routinely looks at to track the status of Great Salt Lake and how it's doing. So this is a plot of salinity in grams per liter shown on the y-axis over time. So this is data for about this past 16 years, starting in 2010. The purple triangles represent shallow salinities, and the purple dots, circled, filled-in dots, represent the deep salinities. And these data are collected at a site we call 3510 in the South Arm in Gilbert Bay. The green line in this plot represents the South Arm lake elevation. And so the first thing we can see is just how dynamic this salinity is. One thing that I love about Great Salt Lake and it being a terminal basin, an endorheic basin, is that it's so dynamic. It's constantly responding to surface water inflows that are coming in and the evaporation that's leaving the system. So it's always sort of in this flux. And so when we get spring runoff, we get all the snowmelt coming in, we see lake elevations rise, as you might expect. And what happens to salinity with that extra volume of water is that the salinity dilutes and you see salinity going down. This is a very predictable pattern through time. Conversely, when we have the rates of evaporation exceeding the rates of inflow, we see lake elevations going down. That concentrates the mass in the system and salinities go up. So this very, again, predictable seasonal pattern that we can rely on happening. Another thing we see from these data are that the connection between the north and the south arm is visible in this simple salinity data set. So in around 2014 to 2016, this is the period of time when the connectivity between the north and south arms was cut off. This is prior to the new breach being constructed. And we saw the water columns mix. So when north and south arms are able to mix because of that density stratification, the north arm sinks below the south arm, and it actually stays there and hangs out there throughout the whole south arm. So when we see the purple dots diverging from the purple triangles, that's when we know the water column, there's a difference in the water column in salinities. We have really, really concentrated brine at the bottom and then fresher stuff at the top. But when that connectivity is interrupted, the two portions of the water column mix and you get a pretty homogeneous salinity throughout. So this is all to just say the connectivity between the north and the south arm really matters, and we can see that very obviously in the data. And then the other thing I'll point out is that the point of berm modification I highlight there in these two black dashed lines that happened in 2022 and 2023 when we raised the berm at the causeway. After that point, we saw salinities really going down. And so I'll just highlight these patterns here. So as Phil mentioned, when we reached historic low lake levels in the fall of 2022, we saw salinities exceeding 180 grams per liter in the system. And as Phil described, we saw visible impacts to the ecosystem. So this was a big concern to the Salinity Advisory Committee. And so with berm modification happening shortly thereafter, what we've observed in the data with its ongoing monitoring are these step changes in the decrease of salinity over time. So after the first year and that big runoff year that Phil described, we had a drop of about 50 to 60 grams per liter in the south arm. Subsequent year, about a drop of 20 to 30 grams per liter, and then more recently, that slope has kind of stabilized, more of a 10 to 15 grams per liter. But we saw this really consistent decline in salinity, such that even though if we compare current lake elevations right now to what we had about 3 years ago, we have about 40 gram per liter less salinity than we did then. And so this is a function, while kind of this interannual change in salinity in response to lake elevation, we see that seasonally. This kind of more multi-year long-term decline, that's due to salt mass. So let's take a look at how salt mass has changed in the South Arm for the last 16 years. So now I'm showing salt mass on the y-axis over the last 16 years, time on the x-axis. And the point of this plot is basically that salt mass is not steady, as Phil already demonstrated. And it's really responding to, again, that connection between the North and the South Arm. When we opened in the new breach in 2016, we saw a huge plummet of salt mass, just as Phil described, then a slow uptick over several years. And then after berm modification, we've seen the mass just steadily decrease. And that's due to berm modification, because what we've done at the breach is basically put in a physical obstruction that prevents North Arm water from coming into the south. So that source of salt mass that used to enter is now cut off. And we see that very visibly in the data. And more recently, if we look at the last few years after berm modification, we can see the slopes and the rate of change that we've been observing. Over the last 3 years or so, we've lost about 200 million tons in the South Arm. And again, the impacts of that are to reduce salinity in the South Arm that we've observed. And then finally, I'll just end with kind of this framework we've developed and that we've started to work with in the Salinity Advisory Committee. And that is because we want to integrate all these three key variables that I mentioned. We want to integrate salinity, the water volume, and the mass. Those three things that we're tracking regularly and put it into a single framework. So I'll just try to walk folks through kind of what this tells us. So on the y-axis, we have South Arm elevation. That's a proxy for the volume, the amount of water in the system. On the x-axis, we have volume-weighted salinity in grams per liter. And then each of those lines kind of behind the plot, those gray lines, represents the salt mass. So you can we're integrating those three variables all together. And so if we pick a mass that we're at, so say 1 million tons here, seasonally we can expect as we increase the water volume, salinity decreases. We kind of move along these salt mass lines. So, and as we remove water from the system, we concentrate the salt. And so seasonally, we have this kind of movement back and forth along a given salt mass line. But we also, as we modify the berm, we have the opportunity to change that mass, as we've demonstrated. And so, if I can get the pointer, here we go. We basically are, through the management of the berm, we can move kind of perpendicular to these lines this way. Oops, sorry, if I can figure this out. Between basically moving from, say, 800 million tons to a billion tons. We can kind of move the amount of mass we have in the system. And so this has kind of allowed us to develop or use it as a planning tool. So we can say if using the measurements we have at the breach, we can estimate how much change in mass we can obtain, and this helps us to just sort of anticipate where we're headed at any given time. And here's an example of where we currently are. Our most recent measurements were on April 7th. We were sitting at 4192.3 feet in the South Arm, a salinity of 117 grams per liter, and 865 million tons. So we can expect with decreasing water elevations that will concentrate salinity this year. So anyway, this is just sort of a way we start to think about it as Salinity Advisory Committee and a tool we employ to anticipate changing conditions. And so with that, I think we'll just start with the questions in the panel. Thanks.
All right, so now you can see why our salinity committee is so awesome. And as far as I'm concerned, just because I saw David O'Leary walk in, I have to say that without Christine, I don't know where we'd be. She's just done tremendous work for the salinity committee, and from my perspective, she walks on water. So I hope you give her a raise, Dave, and that she sticks around so we can continue to do this. Yeah. All right. So this isomass plot is a really good example of some of the work that we've done in the Salinity Committee to kind of better understand salinity and really understand how we project that out into the future and what type of management we need to do to keep it within that range that we want to be at. The salinity concentrations are more of like a daily thing. It's like, where are we at today? But it doesn't really reflect, where we want to be in 6 months or 9 months or 12 months. So this is a really cool tool, and I think it's in the time that I've been with the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands in the last 5 years, it's I consider it kind of groundbreaking as far as like how we move into the next phase of management. So anyway, with that, we're going to ask a few questions and hopefully leave a bit of time so we can get some questions from the audience if you have any. So I just want to ask the whole panel, and y'all don't have to answer, but if anybody would like to speak to, I guess I'll just say the Salinity Committee has accomplished a lot in the short amount of time that they've been in existence, less than a decade. What do you think the future direction for the Salinity Committee will be? What type of issues do you think we need to focus on?
Okay, I guess I'll start with that one. One of the future directions is obviously to continue to manage and use the berm as a tool in an ever-changing lake condition, right? So right now, the berm is a very useful tool under low lake conditions, and that may not become necessary as we increase in lake volume with all of the other actions that we heard about yesterday and all the plans that everybody has to make to, get the lake level back up. This will hopefully become less of a management tool, but it'll still be a tool in our toolbox for future use. And then one of the things, kind of the unintended consequences, I guess we'll bring up nutrients. So one of the things that we're also exporting to the North Arm is nitrogen. And so we're actively having conversations, and hopefully at a meeting in a couple weeks, we're going to discuss how we're changing nitrogen in the South Arm and how that's affecting the biota and the wildlife that are there. And that's going to be kind of a new thing that we're going to have to worry about moving forward is, while we're very good at exporting salt and understanding how that works, we've got to look at what else are we changing.
So I think what Kyle's saying is we're thinking about changing our name to, instead of the Great Salt Lake SAC, we're going to be the SNAC. It's salinity and nutrients, right? Okay, awesome.
Let's just use one. I think, just to echo what Kyle said, I think we've all been really focused on salinity, and we had to be because of the conditions when we reached historic low in 2022. But really, fundamentally, when we're modifying the berm and we're changing the flux between the North and South Arms, there's a whole bunch of other constituents in those waters, nutrients, lithium, all kinds of elements that we're not considering. And so I think fundamentally the Salinity Advisory Committee is going to need to expand our conceptualization of how the system works and recognize that it affects a lot. When we modify and change the exchange between these two bodies of water, there's a lot of potential changes that could be happening that we're not considering. And I think we're just going to need to build out new frameworks to and build new tools to help us wrap our brain around the complexity of all that.
I think the common theme here is transitioning from, emergency action that the Salinity Advisory Committee had been doing into something a little more long-term, a little more of a forecast of what the ecosystem needs and how the committee can help provide that through its recommendations. And so, it's hard to overstate just how effective that was as a management action. It's a very large system, a large lake. It was a very real threat, the salinities that we were getting back then. And the committee moved at a very rapid rate. It was extremely effective, very nimble, and I think it's an excellent model for a bunch of different interests in an ecosystem coming together and working on a problem and coming up with a solution that created a short-term rescue for the ecosystem, essentially. But now that we have been looking at this data, now that that part has been accomplished, now it's going to be trying to look at how do we manage this into the future? How do you find a salinity or salt mass that works into the future? And what other issues do we need to address? Nutrients are certainly one of them. And so, there's work to be done on that. But it's a big success followed by, how do we bring this into the future? How do we manage this longer term?
Fantastic. So it sounds like we all have some job security on our unpaid committee, right? Okay, so Phil, why don't you keep the microphone? I've got a question for you. The Salinity Committee is comprised of various interests and expertise. Tell me about the advantages of these different perspectives and how we all manage these various interests.
Yeah, we've all got our own professional silos, right? We have certain things we do day to day. We have our own professional backgrounds, and that is great because you have detailed knowledge of whatever your field is, but you're kind of limited in some of these other fields. And so having so many different professions on the advisory committee is really beneficial. We have agencies, we have people with background in wildlife, we have people with background in hydrology, engineering, salt extraction, and it's a bunch of professions, and it's a bunch of sometimes differing interests for what they want to see on Gilbert Bay. And so it's great because when you get these people together, there's this mutual respect you can see, and that's something that's not always a given on a natural resource management issue. Sometimes it can be very contentious. There's very little of that with the Salinity Advisory Committee. People come together, they work on this problem, and they get to see the different perspectives from the different interests and from their different professional backgrounds and how they approach a problem and see it from different angles. And so it's been inspiring to actually see what can be something that could get locked down, a thorny resource management issue with a bunch of people arguing. That doesn't happen here. They actually come together and they work respectfully and they find solutions to this problem. So.
I would agree with that. I think we have, a lot of various interests, and as far as I'm, aware, I haven't seen another committee that is able to usually arrive at consensus when we're making our decisions as well as the Salinity Committee does. I've been told we have less than 10 minutes left, so I want to leave a time for a couple questions if there's any in the audience, but I do have a question for you, probably Christine and Kyle. Being that the Great Salt Lake is what I would consider one of the harshest environments we have, especially in Utah, but maybe in the world as we consider the conditions out there in Great Salt Lake, what challenges does that present for the monitoring, the sampling, the operation of the berm, or other just physical challenges that you all see in the work you do?
Yeah, I'll take that to start. So just equipment, right? Maintaining equipment to access the lake. Salt eats everything, and it's ridiculous the amount of time we spend just flushing the equipment, washing the boat, maintaining the boat, changing everything. And I mean, nobody builds equipment for our system, right? We're adapting things that are built for marine systems and then trying to beef them up to withstand the lake. And then with that, some of our processes, so some of our nutrient, they're trying to adapt their tests to facilitate what we need from them, and that's often very difficult.
Yeah. Christine, do you have any thoughts on, I think maybe, ice flows or sediments in, Bear River, or even the work you're doing to monitor within the breach and some of the challenges that presents?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a really dynamic system, and it's huge. It's like on so many scales, it's a massive system. So when you think about something like Bear River outflow, it's a 500-foot wide cross section that's constantly changing, sediments moving all over the place. I mean, it's just absolutely massive on so many different scales. In addition to any equipment we want to deploy, I mean, we would love to be able to measure things continuously. We are now measuring temperature continuously in the South Arm. There's always a risk of ice flows catching our buoys and dragging them all across the lake. Those are huge investments of time, of equipment, of all kinds of resources. And the lake is relentless. It's really dynamic, it's powerful, it's windy. At the breach, I mean, a lot of our measurements, as I mentioned, we kind of do these point measurements of discharge. Those are done under calm conditions. And we recognize that we're missing a huge part of the story because the lake is so dynamic. And you can get huge winds coming out of the north that lead to these unidirectional flows, huge fluxes of everything in the North Arm coming south. We can't capture those because it's so dynamic and it's such a harsh environment that it's really, really difficult to measure. And we're always trying to figure out ways to do this better, but there's physical limitations to what we can do sometimes. And I guess I'll just emphasize, like, this lake is so big. So when we get a measurement at a handful of locations, there's always this question in my mind, are we fully capturing the spatial heterogeneity in the system? Are we capturing shoreline processes? Are we capturing, is the east different from the west? I mean, it's just absolutely huge to think about how we understand everything about this system. Slowly chipping away all the time, but yeah.
Absolutely, and it's 3D. I mean, we have stratification at different times of the year, different paradigms where we have the deep brine layer is present. I mean, it's just constantly changing, and we're constantly having to update and kind of pivot from what we think we know. So that's one of the beautiful things about the Salinity Committee. So before we hop into ask if there's any questions in the audience, I did want to mention that our Salinity Committee meetings are public. So if anybody wants to come join in on these riveting conversations, I'd invite you to come in person or online. We'd love to have you. But with that, does anybody have any questions for myself or the panel? Oh, and Lynn is one of our greatest supporters for the Salinity Committee. She's almost at every single one of them. Yes, those have sustained me for a whole day before, Lynn.
Hey, I do what I can, Ben. My question is, the existing design of the breach and the berm is kind of Flintstone-like, wouldn't you say? So every time you decide to make a modification for elevation and salinity, you have to move rocks. Have you ever talked about design modifications to improve the utility of being spontaneous in achieving those goals?
Oh yeah, we not only have we talked about it, Jacobs Engineering did an analysis for us, and where we looked at all different types of options in the breach. And as we were kind of describing, I mean, this is one of the most harsh environments to put equipment out. The lake just eats everything. So not only do you have to think about, how can we maneuver this piece of equipment, but what's going to withstand the energy and the waves, the salinity and the harsh environment, the corrosive environment, but also still be able to be, maintained. So what they arrived at is we're probably, near $40 million in expense to have the thing that we would actually want. But like 60% of that, if I'm recalling correctly, was tied up in understanding the geotechnical underlying sediments and understanding what could be supported out there. So we could see some substantial cost savings if we were to further investigate that. That is something we're actually pursuing right now, is getting that geotechnical work done and then adding some protective structures in front and of each side of that breach, because we actually, right now, we kind of are in a really lucky spot. And we had a storm event that eroded the berm, and it actually put it right about where we wanted it. So we just left it there. But we would rather be intentional with our movement of that berm. So if we had something that could raise and lower from the top, and then maybe even raise and lower from the bottom when we need to bring salt back, that would be pretty cool. I don't know that it's necessarily going to happen. The rock berm has been phenomenal. The Flintstones had it right, and we're kind of rolling with that right now. But in the future, that may be something we look to. Yeah, go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, you commented on and focused on the brine shrimp and food for the birds, and things weren't contentious. And I'm a little bit surprised about that, in that the mineral companies in the South Arm, they're not probably happy about exporting salts and importing minerals to the north. Could you comment a little bit about how the minerals industry has provided input and how that's been managed?
Yeah, as a non-mineral person, but as someone on the committee and kind of speaking to that, how the committee gets along. We've had a representative of the mineral extraction industries out there. I mean, they're right here in the third row. Thank you guys for coming today. And having everyone at the table has been so beneficial, because they can speak their voice. And so when we say, hey, it's getting too salty for the brine shrimp and we need to do something about it, they were able to come in and say, well, we can't go too fresh because then you're impacting us. And so we have this conversation about compromise and what's beneficial for most of us. And then it is a voting board. We do get votes. And then also it is an advisory committee. So at the end of the day, we're advising state lands and water quality on what they could do, maybe should do. But then it's ultimately up to them with management authority over the sovereign lands. And so they do a very great job of hearing everyone and taking into account their particular things. And I mean, some of the meetings do get a little heated. I mean, we haven't been that way in a while, but
There was a certain change.
yeah.
Right?
But no, it's been really great to, and then to understand that perspective, right? So that we can ask them that question when we say, hey, if we do this for wildlife, what's that going to do to you guys? And then they can come in and say, well, at this time of the year, it's not going to impact us, but at this time of the year, it is. And so that's been highly beneficial.
While you were talking, Kyle, I threw this up on the screen. This is a condensed version of a salinity matrix that was developed in, I think, 2021. 2021. But it kind of takes into account all of the different things that are reliant on certain salinity ranges, including mineral extraction. So again, with all these different various interests, I think we've had a really good conversation and tried to balance the needs of all those various interests to find something that sticks and that works for everybody. And so as far as I'm concerned, we're right in that good spot right now. Yeah, please go ahead.
This was fascinating. Thank you very much. I was wondering, in your circle, is there anyone that studies phytoplankton or monitors that in any way? And then my other question is, do you see any long-term trends with Artemia independent of salinity? And I'm just asking for another salt lake across the way. Thanks.
So the short answer is yes. We monitor phytoplankton because that is the food source for brine shrimp. So that's something that's in our routine monitoring. And that was one of the things that triggered this conversation about nutrients, because we did see some shifts in that. And then another member that's here today, Bonnie, I saw you walk in late. So Bonnie is kind of our extremophile expert on the panel, and it's kind of unfortunate that we only have an hour today, because we probably could have filled the whole day to get everybody on the panel up here to talk about all their special interests and all the cool things that we've done over the years. So this is just a very small snippet of what's going on. As for the brine shrimp, Phil, do you want to address that side of it?
Sure. Long-term trends in Artemia, independent of salinity, is that the question? Well, by and large, the population, there's a bunch of different factors in the population, right? I mean, there's total density, there's the timing of the population, there's the amount of cysts they produce, the quality of those cysts. Long-term trends, I wouldn't say there's anything that really sticks out. They've got these kind of bounds that they operate within, and you tend to see patterns repeat year on year to varying degrees. But the overall theme that we probably see is that if you keep the salinities in the correct range, you have a healthy population, even though it may not look exactly the same every single year. And so as far as long-term trends go, I think it's really tied to keeping the lake within a healthy salinity range, and right now it is. So.
All right. Do we have time for one more? Or, it says time is up on that sign, so I'm going to listen to these folks. Thank you all.
Two men were standing on opposite sides of the river. The first hollered out to the second and said, "How do you get to the other side of the river?" And then the second shouted back, "You're on the other side of the river." The main thing I remember from these forums are the jokes. Okay, we have a panel on evaporation from the lake, so we've heard some of that today. Got a couple of marvelous scientists here who I have the privilege of working with. Paul Inkenbrandt from you. Well, first we're going to hear from, I'll say a couple things, then we'll hand it over to Danyal Aziz, my colleague from the Division of Water Resources, and then Paul Inkenbrandt from Utah Geological Survey, and then Scott Hynek from United States Geological Survey. First, just like to thank everyone for being here. It's a real honor to work with so many excellent people in this field and in this community. Also thank Friends of Great Salt Lake and Lynn. I work here because Lynn gave me a free pass to an issues forum one year, like 8 years ago. Is that better? Did you hear my joke? Yeah. Just kidding. Okay. So thank you, Lynn. I also appreciate working with Friends because Friends is in their name, and it seems like they prioritize collaboration over litigation, and I always see Lynn learning, present, working to make relationships, figure out the complexities of the world we're working in, and then sharing that with others, so I appreciate that. Also appreciate the newsletter. I like the words in there, but I really like the art. And Lynn gave me creative license for selecting the name of our thing here, and we called it "Getting to Know the Invisible Sweaty Giant of Great Salt Lake." And that inspired me, so I drew a picture. At first, I drew a picture of an invisible sweaty giant, but it wasn't very cool, so I made him hairy. Okay, yesterday, Jody mentioned the importance of understanding perspectives. Particularly, she was talking about Utah and Idaho, but perspectives can be helpful, and I find you can get perspective by getting really high. So here's a nice view from a high altitude. And you can see we have the Bear River over here with Bear Lake in the center. Utah Lake stands out. That little star is about where we are. So you can see the kind of the area which drains to the lake, but then you can see the area of the lake. So as Christine mentioned, this lake is enormous. It's a real giant, and you can see kind of the interesting proportions there. I think another point of perspective is about defining what we mean when we talk about the lake. So this is an image that came from work done by Eileen Lukens at Utah State University, working on the Division of Water Rights gap analysis. And this highlights there are these different zones. So we have the lake body, which we traditionally think of the lake. And then you can have these intermediate areas, which may be inundated ephemerally, seasonally, and then even extending out, you have areas that are some are natural, some are managed and engineered, but these wetland areas. So when we talk about the Great Salt Lake, often we're talking about Great Salt Lake ecosystem, but it's important to distinguish between whether you're talking about the actual water body or Great Salt Lake ecosystem. Another interesting thing about this lake, these colors here show the lake at its minimum observed and its maximum observed, and then one right around the middle at 4198. And you can see how the areas vastly change. The numbers are there in square miles, but from its lowest, less than 1,000 square miles, to when at its maximum, to over 2,000 square miles. But importantly, the mean depth of the lake doesn't change all that much. So the lake can drop, 30 feet, and it only drops 10 feet in depth. So it's a shallow lake, and it always is shallow. This is another way of looking at the basin, overhead, and you can see this is a map that our office produces, water-related land use. So the green are irrigated agriculture areas, the gray are urban areas, and then the colors around the lake are either mineral ponds or managed wetland areas. But you can see kind of the relative activity. So, there's a lot of urbanized space there. There's actually not all that much agriculture. But you can see these large wetland areas and also the lake, just kind of give you some surface proportions. And as we're talking about evaporation, if we talk about Great Salt Lake as a being, it consumes water. The numbers that Anna showed from the strike team, kind of average last 5-year human consumption in the basin is around 2.2 million acre feet. Great Salt Lake evaporation, we estimate around 2.1. So, it's a big user, and if we have that number wrong just a little bit, even if it were 10% wrong, which it's more wrong than that, that's 210,000 acre feet, which is basically the amount of water we're looking to get. So, locking in on evaporation is important. Just another thing about perspective, Lake Powell, which second largest reservoir in the nation, we think of that as being really big. These numbers are a little bit old, but it's about 26% full. That's 6.5 million acre feet of 24. And its 5-year average evaporation is 0.34 million acre feet, and it's getting about 10 million acre feet inflow. When we look at the lake, Great Salt Lake, of course, there is no full for Great Salt Lake, but it's about 36% of the historical maximum. That's 12.2 million acre feet of 34, so it's almost twice as much water in there as Lake Powell. And the 5-year evaporation rate I showed there, 2.1 million acre feet, 5-year average inflow only 1.8. So the balance, the Colorado River watershed size relative to the surface area of Lake Powell is so small relative to Great Salt Lake. Okay, one last thing before I pass it over. This shows the surface elevation of the south arm of Great Salt Lake over the water year for the last 3 years and this current year. So you can see there the red in 2023, how it started out. Oh, that's the year we hit the minimum observed elevation, and you can see that massive rise, almost 5 feet. And then it had a stable period, which lasted maybe a month, and then it started to drop off. And it didn't drop off as much as it rose. That's what we'd like to see in the future. But that's not exactly what happened the years after. So in 2024, it rose. It had kind of a longer stationary period, and then it dropped about the same amount that it had risen. And then last year, it rose almost a foot, but fell more than 2. And this year, you can see it hasn't risen much. And most importantly is that stable, that flat period, like look where it starts. It starts way early compared to previous years. And so the rising is when the inflows are greater than evaporation, and the flat period is when they're about equivalent, and when it starts to drop is when the evaporation becomes greater than the inflows. So understanding evaporation controls really when that flat piece starts, how long it lasts, and then how much it drops off. So we'll pass it over to Danyal, and then we'll move through the other two.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everyone. I am Danyal with the Division of Water Resources, and today I will present the results of our pilot study covering the 2024 and 2025 project period. This study represents a critical collaboration between the Division of Water Resources, the Utah Geological Survey, and the University of Utah. So to first understand why we conducted this study, we first must look at the water budget. And in simple terms, we cannot manage what we cannot measure. The Great Salt Lake is a terminal lake with no outlets, which means that evaporation is the primary and essentially the only mechanism for water loss. And historically, the evaporation has been the largest area of uncertainty. While we have decent data on stream flow and precipitation, the evaporation estimates have largely relied on indirect methods, which could not capture the lake's complex dynamics. We often refer to evaporation as the silent giant of the water budget, and to put that into perspective, Jack already talked about it. Consider this, that the lake receives an average of only about 10 inches of direct precipitation annually. However, it loses roughly 40 inches to the atmosphere every single year, and that is a 4-to-1 ratio. And when we are dealing with a surface area of millions of acres, the math becomes staggering. Even a small percent in the error in our evaporation modeling can represent an accounting gap of hundreds of thousands of acre feet. And to put that number into perspective, this is water that is more than some of our major municipal districts that use in a year. So without the accurate outflow data, which is evaporation, managing required inflows is challenging, and we want to ensure that our models are accurate. So to briefly describe the method that we have used for evaporation measurement, we have used a technique which is called the eddy covariance, or EC. Unlike the traditional weather stations which calculate evaporation based on temperature and humidity, the EC towers measure the exchange of water vapor between the surface and the atmosphere. And as we all know, air does not move in a straight line, it moves in turbulent swirls, which are called eddies. And this is where the terms come from. And when these eddies move up from the surface to the atmosphere, they carry parcels of moisture. The EC towers are equipped with high-speed sensors. Specifically, they are called sonic anemometers and infrared gas analyzers. And they sample those air parcels 20 times each second. And by correlating the vertical wind speed with the moisture density of each parcel of air, we can calculate the volume of water that is escaping the surface. We started the pilot study at the 3 key zones of the Great Salt Lake, and one of the key lessons for us was during the pilot study is that the Great Salt Lake is not a uniform surface, and evaporation behaves very differently depending on where we are standing or measuring. For this study, we targeted 3 distinct hydrologic zones in the Farmington Bay area. The mineral ponds, which are managed high salinity brine zones, where commercial extraction takes place. Second was the exposed playa. These are the vast dry lake beds that have become a major concern for dust emissions. And finally, we looked at phragmites, which are the invasive wetland vegetation that form dense stands and are suspected of consuming huge amounts of fresh water before it reaches the lake. The sites that we did not cover in the pilot phase were the lake itself and the open water of the wetlands. These are the sites that we have covered: the mineral ponds, phragmites, and the playa, shown in the red triangles. So one of the interesting findings of this pilot study was what we call the salinity break. And from the literature, we use the value for phragmites to be around 43 inches of evaporation per water year. However, our measurement at this site in the Farmington Bay showed a much lower figure, 33.5 inches. That is a 22% reduction of what we initially thought the value to be. And this difference in the salinity in the Great Salt Lake is because that is what is causing the difference, the reduction in the evaporation. And we also think that this can be a critical finding for policy, because it suggests that while phragmites are still a major water consumer, the water savings that we thought that we would get from removing them might be lower than what we thought. In this table, we see the data for the year 2025 for the three zones, and they show a wide range of values. For example, the phragmites were the most active evaporating zone, losing 33.5 inches, which were largely driven by their sensitivity to the atmospheric demand, the vapor pressure deficit. And the mineral ponds showed a value of 26 inches, and the exposed playa, the dry lake bed, showed a value of 11.4 inches. The playa data, however, comes with a caveat that we observed that when the playa is wet, it loses water at twice the rate when it is dry. We also tested some of the satellite models in these zones, and if the question is like, do satellite models work in these zones, the short answer is not yet. Our comparisons show that the OpenET models, which are commonly used, they systematically overestimate evaporation at the lake by an average of 31%. And in some specific models like EE metric, the overestimation is as high as 48%. The reasons for this difference could be that the satellite models were built for the agricultural sites and not these lake zones. Also, one of the reasons, especially in relation to the phragmites difference, could be the winter bias in the satellite models, where the satellite models continue to estimate water loss during the winter months when the plants are dormant. To go to the next phase of the study, we have already started working on establishment of 3 new monitoring sites, with the highest priority given to the Ogden Bay open water area and the GSL Causeway covering the north and south arms. These new sites, they will allow us to measure the distinct differences between the north arm evaporation and the south arm evaporation, and also what is evaporating from the open water of the wetlands. Our ultimate goal is to integrate all of this data into a single repository and make it available for ingestion into our models. These red encircled sites show the new locations. I also would like to bring attention to the USGS buoys, which will be very critical for this next phase of the study. Those are deployed in the south arm of the lake. The funding sources for our pilot study, the pilot study was conducted with funding, all of the funding available from the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan through the Division of Water Resources. For this next phase of the study for the 3 new sites, our funding comes from the Division of Water Resources, the Great Salt Lake Tech Team Grant, Commissioner's Office, and the Utah Geological Survey. Before giving to Paul, I would like to thank our partners at the UGS and UFU, and also at the USGS for their incredible fieldwork in very challenging conditions. Thank you.
I'm Paul Inkenbrandt with the Utah Geological Survey. I'm a hydrogeologist by training, but it seems like the past 5 or so years I've been focused a lot on meteorology and measuring evaporation and evapotranspiration. We've set up a network of sites across the state, and we start working with the Colorado River Authority of Utah, set up several sites in the Colorado River Basin measuring alfalfa, pinyon juniper, riparian areas, and then we saw this opportunity to measure a Phragmites stand in Farmington Bay and coordinate it with Keith and his group at Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to measure Phragmites before, during, and after their treatment process to see what kind of water savings or changes, the hydrologic changes you would expect as a result of mowing and application of herbicide, and see if that kind of water savings you'd expect matches those expectations. So this is our site here. It's right next to Antelope Island in Farmington Bay. And this was part of what Danyal mentioned as a coordinated project, this pilot study supported by Water Resources and the Commissioner's Office. And it was a great collaboration with John Harrell and his group at the University of Utah, and ramping up with the USGS. And they measured nearby our site at this Playa site that's been operating. Kevin has also been looking at dust out there, and we are excited to expand to measure the open water at the Great Salt Lake. So our site is the UGSPG in this Phragmites stand. And I started out by just doing a basic design and SketchUp of the site. I wanted something I could deploy that wasn't necessarily permanent, that didn't require concrete, and it could be deployed in a challenging, thick Phragmites. Has anyone ever tried to walk through a Phragmites stand? Yes. So it made me want to eliminate that entire patch after that experience. But so I wanted something that could be deployed in this challenging situation, and I took that vision. And SketchUp's scale model person just happens to look like me, except I don't own a ukulele yet. And then this is the result of that, and thanks to the Nature Conservancy for the ride, and they helped us get equipment out there, and we set up this specialized weather station that can measure evapotranspiration of this crop. And it's been a great station, not just for these measurements, but also for collaboration and bringing different organizations together, and we've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different groups. I'm part of the groundwater and wetlands group at the Geological Survey, and so part of our team, they're really good at mapping the wetlands around the lake, and they've been striving to map wetlands across the state. And so we've been coordinating with them and coordinating with Keith's group and the Nature Conservancy. And then we've also been working with Rachel Wood and her students for looking at the microbiology and how it responds to this kind of treatment, and the U of U, of course. So it's been really great to see all of these different people with different specializations trying to understand these very complicated and massive systems. And so, and that understanding will help better manage these systems over time, ideally. This is a map of the extent of the Phragmites stand that we're in. And we're not only measuring the evaporation, the evapotranspiration, but we're also trying to measure the groundwater levels. Dr. Hugh Herlo has some piezometers established around the margins of this stand, and then we've been measuring surface flow into the site over time to see, try to get a better idea of the water moving in and out of this system, both in the ground and over the ground. And so we started measuring. We got 2 summers of measurement, and then in July or September of 2025, the first round of herbicide was applied, and then this last winter is when the mowing occurred. We did not see a physiological response from the herbicide application, and I think that's just because it takes time for the plants to absorb it. Phragmites are extremely hardy and very difficult to eliminate. They're all connected. Becca described to me that they have rhizomes that connect each other and support each other, and so if one part of the patch is hurt, it leans into the other part of the patch to support it, which is something we should do. And so this shows a comparison between OpenET in blue and green and our measurements in orange. And so even though the OpenET values are a little bit higher than ours, the general trends and changes over time are fairly well reflected. There's a significant difference in the early spring, but the high summer values are pretty well represented. And so we could potentially take these types of satellite measurements and use them to better understand the system over time. I think I lost my videos that I had built into this. Imagine this video showing Farmington Bay water slowly receding and then Phragmites patches moving in to replace it, because that's what happened. And that's what we're seeing all across this area in Farmington Bay over time, over the past few decades. And using satellites like Landsat, which have been up in the air since when I was a baby, we can look at changes in not only land cover, but also evapotranspiration over time. And we can look at the individual areas within that Forestry, Fire, and State Land have been managing over time and applying these various treatment types to. And we based on this satellite-based data, we can see savings. And so I did. This is an early preliminary look at the effectiveness of treatment over time. And the x-axis shows the cumulative number of years that we apply treatment to Phragmites, and then the y-axis shows the amount of water savings in inches. And so we could potentially save a lot of water if we continue pummeling this plant year after year. And this is adjusted for control areas. So I took out, try to take out the effects of climate and things like that are influencing this and water level changes. And so this is just trying to look at treatment and how things change over time with treatment. And so we could save upwards of a foot per year, and that doesn't seem like a lot of ET, but that adds up, especially when we have 40,000 plus acres of the invasive type of Phragmites around our lake. And so that's more than 40,000 acre feet per year, easy, potentially. But it's a tough plant to attack, and it requires persistence. And one round, 1 year of treatment isn't going to do it. And so here's the aftermath of the treatment around the frag. The little bits that were hanging around the station were left there just to make sure none of our equipment got clipped. And Keith came in and manually chopped that down, and then, or his group did. And so now we're measuring the aftermath, and that there's a tall thing there with a dome on it. That's actually a loaner instrument that also measures methane. So we're getting some of the first methane measurements from the lake wetlands at our site. And we're excited to move forward and add additional stations in an impoundment system and in over open water. And I think it'll be a good complement to Scott's buoy measurements for our open water settings. Danyal and some of the UGS people went out and checked out, found a good spot along that railroad causeway, I think, for some good lake measurements and salinity measurements. So, great, and that's all I have.
Hi, Scott. I told Jake that this would be 5 minutes, It was neither a promise nor a threat, but I think I'm going to take one extra because of the panel before me. I'm quaking in my boots because Phil and Kyle and Ben, it's a really high standard, okay? Really effective. And then I want to acknowledge the bravery of these gentlemen for studying evaporation. And Paul might be proof that no good deed goes unpunished. If I was you, I'd be doing more hydrogeology. And then, you know, years ago when Christine was getting interested in nutrients on the lake, I told her, well, whatever you do, don't do nitrogen isotopes, because I've seen that ruin a number of careers. I kind of feel the same way about evaporation, but here I am. So what I want to just show you quickly is how I got involved in this against my better judgment. What we're contributing in terms of data, and then I'll come right back to where Jake was and just give us a little perspective. So my colleague Will, long-term colleague and friend, is here from Vermont. He flew in last night, my colleague Will. And I read this paper of his in 2021, and I said, whoa, you know, Lake Bonneville is completely controlled. That different water balance, that different water budget is completely controlled by temperature, was the conclusion from this. And I thought, well, you know, if we flip that, well, what does this mean for the future, right? And so I called him, and I'm sure he regrets that phone call too. So just wanted to show you this. This is from the very first USGS public report ever. This is a sketch from the late 1880s, almost exactly 20 miles straight across the valley. And these are the Lake Bonneville shorelines. And this is just, again, after the Bonneville flood, the water balance is just all of the discharges to the atmosphere. And so that balance or that budget that would have drowned us here, and you know, if you look kind of about where those blue arrows are, they're supposed to highlight the shorelines, but they're also pointing at the University Guest House. We would be, you know, pretty wet. And that is mostly due to temperature, not due to precipitation. So just want to kind of underline that point. And then I want to make a plug for Will's poster over here. I really put him through the ringer on this one, and he would love a little moral support. And, you know, one of the things we've looked at is evaporation as a function of lake elevation, right? Because your surface area to volume ratio changes. He's incorporated here industrial withdrawals a bit, you know, mineral ponds, things like this. 4°C warming scenario. And I was sort of surprised. The news is actually quite good. Maybe not about, you know, Paul said to me, oh, 10%, that might be. That I think we're not doing. That's really optimistic. And so I encourage you to talk with Will and consider some of that. But the cool thing is, under a 4-degree warming scenario, the increased water to maintain the same lake level is similar to the uncertainty. So what it means is it's not, nearly as bad as it sounds when you compare it to Lake Bonneville. And then one of the things that you know, we contribute in this scenario, and where I really, you know, I'm interested in mass budgets typically for the lake, salt, nutrients, other things. And we have a number of inflow sites and lake sites, different configurations where we try to understand what's coming and going and what's staying and all of that. And so one of the things that underpins the modeling and the meteorological work that Will has done is just a volume balance, right? This is just inflow and outflow, and of course, the outflow is just evaporation. And as Jake was pointing out, when it's level, well, it's balanced, right? And if we know what's coming in, we know what's going out, right? Steady state. And now I want to highlight some of that buoy data really quickly right here. So this is vertical temperature in the south arm, okay, through about a week of time. What you see is diurnal heating. So it gets hot at the surface, propagates to some depth, and it kind of resets every day. But then at some point in time here, around the 17th of August, it goes fully isothermal, okay? So that's the same temperature top to bottom. And the point here is that temperature and mixing are really important for evaporation, and it's not real simple. Every day is different out there. And if you look at our wind record from that same site, what you see is a series typically of evening gusts that cross 20 miles an hour, and you're switching from southeast to northwest, okay? And if we pick those up and put them back onto here, what you see is to fully mix this lake out in that kind of scenario, and every week's different, you know, it takes some sustained kind of wind. And this is just thermal mixing, right? Okay, like there could be salinity stratification that's not totally picked up with this. But this is really important for the energy balance of the lake, which of course controls the evaporation. Now, I'll just try to go through this quickly, but this is some satellite data from Climate Engine. This is really easy to use if you're curious. Even a geochemist can do this. And the cool thing is you can see Great Salt Lake, right? And what we're looking at here is land surface temperature changes. This is Landsat, like Paul was talking about. And this is the last 20 years. So what you're plotting, what you see plotting there is degrees Celsius per year change in land surface temperature. Okay, this is one of the satellite products out of the box that I feel more comfortable with. Okay, so you're in space, but we can also travel in time, right? So what I'm plotting is a rate of change per unit time. And what you're seeing there, if we take that to the 99% confidence interval, well, all the other stuff falls away, except for the lake, mostly. And we're through, I'm just going to show you a couple slides like this. This is just June, July, August average. So this is the highest evaporation season, okay? And this is from 2000 to 2022, about 2.2 degrees Celsius warming of the land surface, okay? Now that might not have been land always, right? That might be water, okay? So if we just switch what we want to plot and analyze here, you see what this satellite thinks is water, it's the same thing. Okay, so the lake is contracted, the land surface is getting warmer. So this is important for the surface energy budget. You can see, you know, some places where maybe there's more water in these mineral ponds. So that's increasing, and you know, this is again the 99% confidence interval. So they're these are about 1 kilometer grid cells. And then, well, this is it, and this really brings it right back to where Paul was and what Keith works on, right? So the water goes away, the land surface gets hotter. Okay, those are both kind of bad for the surface energy budget. But then you're also going, this for me is, you know, you're also going from, there's ET, right? And then there's E, which is one of the hard ones, right? Open water evaporation, right? It may yet, anyway, I'm running, it's not gonna ruin my career. I can run faster than that. As the lake recedes, it's also colonized by terrestrial vegetation, and you go from E to T, okay? And if, you know, Paul got some measurements off of Joe's ponds, they look a lot smaller than what he's getting out of this Phragmites stand at Farmington Bay. This conversion of one land type to another is something I think that's of critical concern. And I would take this with a grain of salt, of course, especially in the North Arm and the west side, but I mean, there's no doubt that Farmington and Ogden Bays are under siege. So, yeah, that's what I can offer you guys. Thanks. Is that interesting? Are there any questions? If there are any questions, you could line up. We'll give, that way we know. So, yeah, I lament that John Harrell isn't here. John's a long, old-time professor at the U, and we really relied on his expertise for designing a lot of this and giving us recommendations for setting up the pilot and then moving to the next phase. Okay. It's clear from this panel, and as was mentioned by everybody, that there's collaboration. Tell us, why is collaboration needed for something like this, and how have you gone about it through this project or others?
I can't do everything. So, and there's people who are much better at other things than, so, and the UGS and the USGS, they're research groups, right? But there's a management component, there's land management and access and other interests and momentum that we build off of from other groups. And working together and communicating together is much more effective at good management than doing it separately.
Well, and talk about how did identifying the location for where you put it, how did that go?
Start with the locations.
Well, I'm asking Paul mainly. Paul, because we were talking about this, I came to your office, talked about it, and then how did it go? How did you figure out where to put it?
We reached out to Keith Hambrecht, and he helped us find a spot that we knew was going to be managed. He actually reached out to us, and then he has been wanting ET measurement around the Phragmites for a minute, and so he helped us find a spot that we knew was going to get treated soon and is going to undergo some pretty significant changes, and that was coordination with Forestry, Fire, and State Land. And then, there's research support, too, and monetary support that goes into that, and learning how to manage data and do good measurement. And so John Harrell's group was essential for that at the U.
Totally. Danyal, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, regarding the collaboration, so like at the Water Resources, mainly we do modeling. And we were interested in the data, so we were looking for partners who do the actual field work. And UGS has been doing the ET measurements for a long time now. Other than the lake, they have the UGS Flux Network. And also in a similar way, we found the U of U Atmospheric Sciences Department, which had already some installed towers. They were measuring meteorological and other variables of interest at least 2 of the sites. So that's how the collaboration developed.
Great, thank you. Scott, do you have any thoughts? You don't have to.
Well, I would just say that sometimes monitoring is always ongoing, and a lot of this stuff is opportunistic. So collaboration happens because someone's been collecting data, or Keith's got a plan, or whatever, and so you don't always know, and that's part of people sharing data and ideas, and also what they're working on is critical, so you don't miss opportunities. And the monitoring is kind of the expensive part, but a lot of times it's the missing part, because when you're doing this stuff, you're springboarding off of something else. There's huge sunk cost, right? You rarely start this stuff, from scratch.
Yeah, monitoring is expensive. That's one reason we model, but models aren't good unless we have data, so we have to have the data. And yeah, I think what you're pointing out is that this all happened because you knew people to talk to. And so
That's why forums are so valuable. Okay, question.
Yeah, I had a quick question based off of that for Daniel. You talked about the satellite remote sensing models not being great with the data that you collected. Is there any plan to build your own models to link satellite data with some of the monitoring data that you guys have done?
Yes, we do. So the first step, like when we collect any field data, the benefit of that is that we can use it to calibrate the existing models. And the two reasons that I talked about why the discrepancy is between the satellite and the field data is because the models are built for like a specific case study when they are starting. In this case, we not only plan to like calibrate the existing models but develop our own models. That will mainly again be driven by satellite measurements, but that will not be like just an OpenET model that will give us direct evaporation, but instead it will be other variables that we can use to predict evaporation and evapotranspiration and use our field collected data to calibrate those.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Both of you guys mentioned, monitoring evapotranspiration, but it sounded like you used different methods. And I'm just curious, you mentioned that the evapotranspiration was, overestimated by the satellite models compared to your, your site, and that it was because of, salinity stress. My question is, did you only monitor that one site or measure that one site, or were you looking like along the gradient of, the wetland, because it starts out being fresher and, it gets saltier the further down gradient you get. And so I'm just wondering, like with your two, were you guys both measuring kind of the same thing? And I guess I'm a little confused by that, so.
I can give a brief answer and then Paul can talk about the details. So the results that I was showing was for the Phragmites site specifically, so that is ET, evapotranspiration. Yes, so just the one site, and then the reason that I described is like maybe because the model is developed for measuring ET at a standard agriculture site, while this is a site where there is salinity and which can decrease the ET. Yes, that's what we think. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul. So yeah, she's just repeating the question. Basically, the question is, we're measuring, we're trying to measure ET at a single point, and the question is, well, there may be a gradient of salinity or water conditions so the ET could change, throughout the stand of Phragmites. Paul, do you have any other comment?
Yeah, this is way out of my wheelhouse because I'm definitely not a plant physiologist, but talking to our wetland specialist, we would expect higher ET tied to a fresh environment. So,
and it's not quite, I don't think we quite understand, surface salinity or shallow salinities.
Unlike a regular even regular met stations require a lot of work and maintenance and expense and personnel time. Operating one of these eddy covariance sites is extremely intensive, and so we have to be very selective. And as Christine mentioned, this area is huge, and that's why we turn to models and remote sensing, and we try to tune in those things based on a few select measurements here and there, and maximize what funding we do have. With these limited sites.
Thanks, Paul. We can follow up with more. Go ahead.
Brenda.
So it's striking that the amount of water evaporating is similar to some of the amounts we're talking about needing to get back in, right? So I'm wondering if the conversation has gone to pilots around mitigation to reduce evaporation, right? I know there's other experiments across the Southwest with things that you could put in place to physically, reduce the amount of evaporation off surfaces, or at industrial sites, capture the evaporation and put it back into the system. So where are we in terms of managing evaporation?
Is there something that we could do to reduce evaporation from Great Salt Lake?
Yeah, or is that been tested
aside from letting it dry out?
I'll say a little something and then pass it to Danyal. I think before we can manage, we have to know how much. And so we don't even know that yet, which we want to know. And so I think to best manage the water resources here in the state, we need to measure them and understand them. And once we have an understanding of how much, then maybe we can start to throw different management approaches.
I can think of one solution is the Phragmites removal. So that is reducing evaporation. If we remove the Phragmites, the water that would be evaporated would instead go to the lake. Because the lake has a high salinity, so the evaporation rate, as my hypothesis, that it would be significantly lower than what it would be when it is in the wetlands, watering the Phragmites.
Thanks, Danyal. I could write a short booklet on all of the really wild ideas that I receive on a regular basis for how to do that. One thing I would point out, though, is if you saw Kevin Perry's presentation yesterday, you know that he showed a cost per unit for doing a type of dust mitigation measure. But when that's extended over the exposed area of the lake, it becomes, almost just ridiculous costs. So that's how this is too. There could be ways to reduce surface evaporation from small reservoirs, but to apply that to Great Salt Lake is really just a completely different scale. Okay, we'll go here and then Wayne if there's time.
So related, is this on?
Yes.
Related to that, do we have a good understanding of how native plants or native grasses and stuff that is supposed to grow on the shores of Great Salt Lake, how that compares in terms of evapotranspiration to Phragmites?
Yeah, good question. Anyone here want to ask? Otherwise, there are people in the audience who could answer this probably.
So that's a great question. And that's one of the things I want to look at with some of the remote sensing data we have available to us. And so we've been working with Keith to pick out some good spots where he's planted those kind of plants and they're actively growing after the Phragmites treatment. And so we want to look at that and compare native. And you have to remember that it's not just a change in hydrology. There's ecosystem changes happening at these sites and other important carbon exchanges and things like that. So that you have to have a holistic viewpoint, which speaks back to collaboration with other groups.
Anything else?
I would say also Phragmites is relatively homogeneous at some scale. And when you replace it with more natural or native systems, you're getting small pools of open water, you're getting patchier vegetation, right? And so now, I want to continue to distinguish between E and T, okay? So Phragmites does not evaporate, it transpires. And so you're getting a mix of both of those processes happening. When you have Phragmites stand, it's pure transpiration, okay? But when you have open water patches and native vegetation and lots of diversity, you're getting both. And I think it would be really hard to predict what's going to happen without observing.
Yeah, and in scientific literature, there are other studies that have looked at other areas and plant types, and sometimes we use those rates here. Keith, did you? Oh yeah, we recently collaborated on a memorandum which we share with the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, looking at ET use or estimating ET use around from Phragmites around Great Salt Lake, and then trying to quantify how much water savings there would be if we replaced, if we removed the Phragmites. But an important point that Keith brought up is that we don't simply remove Phragmites, right, and leave exposed playa. We replace it with some type of native plant type that's suitable to that area. And so we had to make estimates of what that ET would be from those plants, and we do that using mostly literature values. Okay, Wayne?
Yeah, so far we've got measurements in the periphery of the lake, but not the lake itself. And so the tower on the causeway presumably is set up to do that, you do get different evaporation rates from water with different salinity. Salinity lowers evaporation. So I'm curious with the placement on the causeway, how you're going to differentiate between north arm evaporation versus south arm.
So this was John Harrell's idea at the U. I love your work, by the way. But he had the idea to have one system pointing north, one system pointing south. With that, we'll have water measuring instrumentation that measures salinity, temperature. We'll have a temperature gradient set up. We'll have the USGS buoys for the south arm. And so combining those measurements, and we can, these stations, their measurement footprint is based on wind direction, and that we call it fetch. And so they measure upwind. The wind blows towards the instrument, and that's the footprint of the measurement. And so we will base we'll know where our footprint is based on where the wind is coming from. Thanks, Wayne. That's a good question.
Okay, we're out of time, but thank you for the questions. Let's hear it for our government scientists.
A happy break. We'll see you back at 10:30.